Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the International Festival of Economics, and welcome to Collegio Carlo Alberto. Before we begin, I'll just give you some technical information. Please scan the QR code that you find on your paper documents, and to then give your opinion on the festival so that we can improve it even more in the next editions. It is an honor and it's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Karen Hoxby, one of the most prestigious researchers in public economics and a relevant figure in the field of education economics in the world. Karen Hoxby teaches at the Scottish Bonnian Faculty at the University of Stanford, where she is also senior fellow for the American for the National Bureau of Economic Research, where she worked. She studied at Harvard, at Oxford as a Rose grantee, and the MIT when she completed her PhD. During her career, Karen Hoxby tackled some of the most important issues on the impact of educational systems on economic and social outcomes. Her pioneering research have transformed the academic debate and have also deeply influenced public policies. Among her most significant contributions, I can mention studies on the freedom of school choices, on the effectiveness of charter schools, which in the United States are funded with public money but have much more autonomy than traditional schools. She's also worked on the role of trade unions for teachers. She's worked on the competition between school institutions, educational institutions. She studied the impact on of students and teachers on educational outcomes. She's also worked on the determining factors in access and success to university education. She's also analyzed in great detail the economic results of education, showing how the quality of education determines income, employment, and social mobility. Her work on access to university for brilliant students who, however, come from economically disadvantaged contexts has been particularly interesting. Her studies show that many of these students, although they deserve it, give up enrolling in the most prestigious universities. Karen Hoxby puts forward an income system for professors and teachers based on merit, and she therefore proposes to reward with higher wages the teachers, the professors who are most effective in improving learning for students. She also shows how such a reform, which would be sustainable with current resources, would significantly improve the quality of education. The influence of Professor Hoxby goes well beyond her exceptional academic successes. She was a consultant of national governments and large philanthropic organizations. Her research is the basis as expanding college opportunities and initiatives that's helped thousands of students who deserve it, who come from low-income families, to access and succeed at prestigious and highly selective universities. She's won several awards, including a Arthur Sloan grant and further awards. She's also a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Professor Hoxby also has a role as mentor, something that she does with great devotion and commitment. She supports PhD theses, and she's inspired a whole generations of economists whose contribution keeps on deeply influencing the discipline of economics. The rare combination of clarity and rigor has left a remarkable mark in the discipline. Today, Professor Hoxby is going to talk about how decentralized systems like the United States ones and more centralized educational systems like the Italian one, in general European systems, often let talented students leave school, and it's a great privilege now to have her here with us. We welcome her with a warm welcome, and we give her the floor. Thank you very much.
Grazie, Nadia.
Thank you, Nadia, for this introduction, these kind and generous words. I also would like to thank the organizers of the festival. In particular, I would like to thank Dito Boeri and all those who have worked with him. My slides are in Italian, but I will speak in English because my Italian is too slow for an economist. Thank you once again, and thank you to the translators who are going to help me.
So my title today is Missing Talent, an International Comparison, and I'm going to specialize today in comparing the United States and Italy, and you'll see my hypothesis in just a moment. Okay, that's just the English version. All of the slides are in Italian, but I'll be speaking in English, so that's a little fair. You can read in Italian, or you can listen to the translation in Italian, but I'll be speaking in English. Okay, what is missing talent? What do I mean by missing talent? What I mean by missing talent are people who are of great ability, who do not end up taking advantage of the opportunities that are available to them that they would actually prefer to take. And they don't take advantage of them either because they don't understand that they're available to them, or others have excluded them from those opportunities. And the people who are great missing talents end up not only having a career and a life that may be short of the life that they wanted to lead themselves, but also they may produce fewer benefits for the economy and society than they would have been able to produce. Nadia, can you get them to turn on the timing so that I can see? Okay. All right. So, why are we particularly interested today in highly developed countries? We're interested not because there aren't very talented people in less developed countries in the world, but because there are two reasons why we're especially interested in highly talented people in highly developed countries. The first reason is that it's really a mistake that they don't end up taking advantage of the opportunities that are available to them. It's not that they live in a country where they are too poor or the country is too poor to give them educational opportunities. There are opportunities there, and they're mistakenly not taking advantage of them. It's an error. And the second is that in highly developed countries, people who are extremely talented disproportionately contribute to economic growth and societal well-being, and that's because these are economies that depend a great deal on skill-intensive industries and innovation for their growth and for societal well-being. So we are interested today in highly developed countries, and I'm just not going to apologize for not being interested today in developing countries, even though, of course, they contain many extremely able people. I'm also going to be talking mainly about the top 10% of people in terms of cognitive talent or cognitive ability today. Why is it that I'm interested in cognitive ability? It's not that there aren't other abilities. Obviously, there's musical ability and artistic ability and athletic ability, all kinds of other abilities. But cognitive ability is most closely related to education, and it's most closely related to skill-intensive industries. So, and the economy that's innovation-based. So, it's also easily measured, cognitive ability, so that's why I will be interested in talking about that today, and I'll be focused on that. So when I say missing talent, I'm really thinking of people who are in the top 10% in terms of their cognitive talent and are not taking advantage of the educational and career opportunities that should be there for people who are that cognitively talented. Okay, who are the cognitively talented people who are missing? Well, they're people who would otherwise be innovators or contributors to public goods. And this is through any number of channels, but the most obvious ones are that they're innovators. They're people who, like us, I hope, do policy innovation so that we as economists think that we're improving the world by trying to give people new policy ideas. That would be one type of innovation. Scientific discovery, inventions, all kinds of strategic thinking, strategic insights. And all kinds of other types of things in which people can contribute to social life and innovation. Well, one thing to understand about the very talented in the world is that a very small share of talented people in the world, people who are highly cognitively able, make up a lot of the total innovation and contributions to public service in the world. We're going to look at the distribution of contributions in a moment, but by most measures, whether it's, for instance, the growth of GDP, or the growth in earnings, the growth in the wealth of a country, or measures of innovation such as patents or citations or expenditures on research and development, or if we look at things like public service, for instance, leading a non-governmental organization or a charity, making big innovations in public medicine, they tend to be contributions of a very small share of people who make a very large share of the total contributions. In fact, the estimates are that about 2% of the people in the world make about 30% of the contributions that are related to innovation and growth. This is what's called the power law, and the power law I've shown here is a distribution that shows that there is a very long right-hand tail of this distribution, so that people who are in the top few percent, there's not very many people, but they're making much bigger contributions than the majority of people. So the majority of people are down here, only a few percentage of people are up there, but they make a very large share of the total contributions. Therefore, when we think about a country, if you're missing only, say, 20% of the most talented people in your country, they don't get a university education, they don't take advantage of their opportunities and so forth, you could be missing out on 20% of your growth, 20% of your innovation and so forth. So it's maybe a small number of people, but it's a very significant thing for the world. And the estimates are that by recuperating, say, 20%, finding 20% of the people who are missing right now as top talent in your country and making sure that they are fostered, you could raise your real growth rate by as much as 0.25 or 0.25% per annum, and that would be a tremendous, tremendous amount over 10 years, 20 years, something like that. It really does add up. Okay, now why is it that people who are highly able, have great cognitive ability, great talent, why is it that they go missing? Economic theory suggests that there are two reasons. The first one is that they take themselves out of the running. There are opportunities in front of them and they don't take advantage of those opportunities. And usually, economists think that this is because they don't really fully understand the opportunities that they are turning down. The second theory, or the second channel, is that the system of education in a country eliminates them. At some point, when they are younger, the system says, we don't think you're as talented as in fact they really are, and channels them towards an education or a career that is less ambitious than the career or the education in which they would be able to thrive. So those are the two channels. Now, I'm going to hypothesize today and try to test for you and convince you that there's some evidence that the first channel is most operative in very decentralized countries like the United States. The United States has an extremely decentralized system of education. I'll describe it to you a little bit, but if you want to know more, do ask during the question period. It's so decentralized that I can't describe it to you well. That's how decentralized it is. The decentralized system of American education, that what it does is it loses talent mainly through channel one. In other words, very talented people take themselves out of the education system and out of very ambitious careers because they don't understand the opportunities that they are turning down. It's a very complicated, complex system. I will also argue, or at least try to test the hypothesis, that very centralized systems, mainly they lose talent through the other channel, that the system itself tends to refuse opportunities at some point to a person who's very talented, but perhaps doesn't look very talented at that stage, maybe an early stage, and then they never end up getting back into the system and taking full advantage of their opportunities. So both types of systems, decentralized and centralized, have opportunities for missing talent. They're just not exactly the same channels for losing talent. Okay, let me first try to describe our crazy American system, which is extremely decentralized. So first of all, it is truly a decentralized system. My students, my PhD students, when they come and talk to me about wanting to work on American education, the economics of education, I roll my eyes and I say, you don't understand, it will take you forever to learn. There are 15,000 school districts in the United States, and each one of them does its own thing. They're all autonomous. Okay, so it's pretty crazy. There literally is no central control of education in the United States. There is tremendous competition among institutions, especially at the higher education level, among universities. They compete with one another. The private sector plays a very large role in the United States, a smaller role in primary and secondary education, but in higher education, the private sector plays a very large role. In fact, many of the famous universities of which you will have heard, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, University of Chicago, they're all private universities. There is no such thing as a normal admissions credential for getting into post-secondary school. For instance, everyone in Italy who wants to go into university takes the maturità. There's no such thing. Nothing. There are 2 voluntary college admissions exams in the United States. There are some other ones that people can take. No one has to take anything. People don't take the same exams. Different states have different exams. They're not comparable to one another. That's the crazy United States. So there's no common credential. There is no level of tuition that is common across universities. So in Italy, you know what tuition you're going to pay, if any, when you go to university. In the United States, even if you look at the tuition that a university puts online, lists online, that's not how much you're going to pay. Each person pays a different amount depending on his or her individual circumstances. So you cannot know how much you're going to pay until you apply and get admitted, and they tell you how much you are going to pay. So it's very individuated. There's a lot of variation in resources between universities that are apparently giving out the same degree. Also, the curriculum of study differs from university to university, even if they're giving out apparently the same degree. There's almost no transparency about quality, so I can't really compare one university to the other and say, I know that this university's outcomes are better than that university's outcomes. I might, as a statistician or an econometrician, I might be able to know that, but the normal person wouldn't know that. The amount that I pay in tuition has almost no correspondence to how much was spent on my instruction or on other things to do with my attending university. And finally, it's very common in the United States for students to enroll in university, then drop out of university, spend some time doing something else, then they transfer to another university, drop out again, then they transfer to another university, then drop out again, and then they might finish up when they're 35 years old, but they're finishing the first degree. It's not a second degree, it's not a third degree, it's the first degree. They're just rehabilitating themselves or recuperating. Okay, very strange system, and confusing for people. Okay, in reality, this is not a system. It's just a marketplace. And that's why it's so confusing to people, because it's a market, it's not a system. Okay, if we think about a centralized system of the Italian type, you can see that it's very different, based on what I just said, and you all know the Italian system. There is a certain amount of central government control, although there is some regional autonomy in a country like Italy. You know, the different regions do have different universities. The government tends to suppress competition among the universities. It doesn't allow the different universities to pay very different salaries, for instance, or have very different admission standards, with the exception of some elite universities that you know of. The private sector plays quite a small role in a country like Italy. There is a common set of admission standards. Everyone takes the maturità, and so therefore everyone is on a similar scale in terms of thinking about how qualified they are for admission. Tuition tends to be either free or very low, or at least you know what it is. It's not personalized. Most of the universities have kind of common, similar levels of resources, so that makes them more similar to one another. There are centralized standards of the curriculum and so forth, and the quality tends to be somewhat similar among universities that are at the same level in Italy. And finally, if we look empirically, it is not common for Italians to start a degree, drop out, transfer to another university, restart the degree, drop out, transfer. So this system of kind of dropping out and transferring and rehabilitating is not common in Italy. In fact, it's not common any place except in the United States, I think. Italy is not the most centralized system of universities in the world. I would say in Europe it's definitely the French, because on top of the sort of centralization that Italy has, the French, as you know, they have this whole system that is above the normal universities, les grandes écoles, and they're mostly located in Paris, the center of the universe, as we all know, and they're the most prestigious universities. So if we look at a spectrum of centralization, the most decentralized university system or educational system in the highly developed world is that of the United States, the Stati Uniti, and then the United Kingdom. Italia is someplace along the way towards centralization, and I think France is even more centralized than Italy's. Okay, now let's say that no talent went missing. None of these no one who was talented went missing in the world. Everyone achieved the level of education and career that was optimal given their native cognitive ability. Well, what we would see is something like this graph. Okay, so on the horizontal axis, what I have is different degrees, different educational degrees, and they're listed from elementare, licenza media, all the way up to dottorato, okay? And on the vertical axis, I have the level of cognitive ability. So let's say that everyone who was of higher cognitive ability ended up getting a higher degree, then you would see a graph like this. This is a classic box and whisker chart where the box shows you the difference between the 25th and the 75th percentile in ability for a certain level. I'm showing you for people who get a dottorato. And the two whiskers, this one and this one, show you the 10th and the 90th percentile for the people who are getting the dottorato degree. So that's the ability range for people who are getting that degree. And if we look down at the bottom, say elementare, you can see, again, that there's a range here between the 25th and the 75th percentile, and then the whiskers show you the rest of the ability range. And if everyone who was of higher ability always got a higher degree, it would just go up something like this. And you'll notice that although the different degrees overlap a little bit, they don't overlap that much. So in general, someone who's getting a dottorato probably has higher cognitive ability than somebody who stops at licenza media. Okay? So everyone understands what that, so that's what it would look like if no one went missing. Now let's say that instead people go missing essentially at the end of lower secondary school or the beginning of upper primary school. So at the end of lower secondary or one of the first degrees in upper secondary, for instance, the corsi regionale brevi, okay? Then what you would see is there would be a lot of mass right here where people of high and low ability end up stopping at that amount of education because they get tested, people say you're not ready to go on to a liceo, and so they stop. They go to maybe a corso regionale, and then they stop with that and they never go on to university, right? So that's kind of what we would see there. And the missing talented people would be in this group, and you can see why we think they're missing talented people, because these people actually overlap in cognitive ability with these people who are getting much higher degrees, but they're not getting a high degree. They stop much earlier in education, okay? Oh, here's another example. In this example, the people are getting sort of stopped in their very early degrees of post-secondary education, their first or second years of post-secondary education, so not one of the higher degrees, not something like a corso post laurea or the dottorato. Instead, they're stopping around here. And again, you can see that that must be some missing talent, because some of those people are very high cognitive ability, but they don't go on to a higher level of education. Okay, so that's the idea of what it is we're going to be looking for later. All right, so those box and whisker charts can be quite useful. The next thing we're going to do, just to set a baseline, is to look at a comparison between the United States and Italy in terms of educational attainment of adults. So this is just educational attainment of adults. These are native born in both countries, to get rid of the confusion that might be around immigrants who don't necessarily go through your educational system. And Italia is in green. I even chose the correct green for Italy. I looked it up. I looked it up very carefully. It's a specific RGB number. Okay, and the Stati Uniti are in purple, because our colors are also red and blue, and we don't want red, because then it would confuse you guys, right? Okay, so, all right, so we're in purple, and Italia is in green. And these are the actual levels, so these are international levels of educational attainment. And you can see there are two big differences between the United States and Italia. The first is that the number of people who stop at secondaria inferiore is much greater in Italy than it is in the United States. In fact, in the United States, you can't really stop there, because we don't have any stopping points between first grade and 12th grade. You can drop out, but there's no threshold, there are no choices, there are no different types of high schools in the United States, so you just have to either drop out or stay in high school. There's nothing else to do, for the most part. Then the other thing that's very different is post-secondary, but with no diploma. This is very common in the United States because, as I told you, so many people initially start in university and then they drop out and they never get a diploma. And you can see that's not common at all in Italy, but it's very common in the United States. Okay? All right. This is just the same slide in English. Another thing that we can do to try to understand or make a comparison between Italy and the United States in terms of where the missing talent is to look at how people are enrolled by age, enrolled in schooling by age in the two different countries. So this is on the bottom, years of life. So this is a 15-year-old up to a 45-year-old. And this is the probability that they are still attending school at that age. And you'll notice, of course, that it goes down for everyone, because people start attending school, they're still attending school at age 15, and by the time they're 40, 45, they're not attending school very much anymore. But we can notice there are two differences between Italy and the United States. The first one occurs early on, so let's do a close-up of that. This is between the ages of 17 and 22. And you'll notice that the United States always has a somewhat higher attendance rate, but it's not very big here, and it's not very big there, but it really opens up at like 19 and 20 and 21 years old. And that is where Americans are continuing to go on to post-secondary education, maybe not completing it, but continuing to go on to post-secondary education, and Italians are moving out of schooling and going into the labor force more at those ages. So that's a big difference, and suggests that there's something different in that behavior making the transition to university. And then the other time where they're very different is, you can see out here, by the age of, say, 42, 43, 44, almost no Italians are still enrolled in school. Right? But 5% of Americans are still enrolled in school. And they are not getting our second or third degrees or some fancy graduate or doctorate degree. They're still trying to get that first degree, the first laurea, the first baccalaureate. Okay, they're just continuing to go back and forth and try to get it. So that's a big difference between the two countries. Okay, so what does the evidence so far, it's very basic, but what does it suggest? It suggests that for Italians, if they are going to be lost, it's going to be relatively early on in their educational careers, at the end of lower secondary school, at the early years of upper secondary school, not so much in university. Once Italian students get to the post-secondary or university stage, they tend to complete the degrees with which they started. So that suggests that the missing talent goes missing pretty early. And in contrast, most Americans stay in through the end of high school, because as I said, there are no different types of high schools in the United States. But then when they have to make the transition to going to university, there are a lot of students who go missing at that point because they cannot figure out how to make the transition well. It's a very confusing system for all the reasons that I described before. So my way of thinking about this is the Italians, the centralized system is more likely to push out a child, or an adolescent actually, unwittingly or unintentionally at a relatively early stage, who doesn't do well on the lower secondary school leaving exam. And the United States, students are likely to take themselves out because they don't understand how to make the transition to going to university, and they don't understand whether they're prepared or not for university. That's why so many of them go and then drop out. Okay, so just summarizing, the evidence suggests that the decentralized system is more likely to have people take themselves out, and the centralized system is more likely to take out people unintentionally, but nevertheless take them out. Now, I have said this, and so far I haven't been very focused on the most talented people, but let's look at the evidence for the most talented people, and for this, I'm going to focus on some work that I've done with Christopher Avery and Sarah Turner and for the United States. And we're going to look briefly at an experiment, and you'll see why it is that I feel very strongly that in the United States it's people who take themselves out when they're very talented. Okay, these are the admissions portfolios. In other words, all of the places that a student applies to university in the United States, where we have the most selective universities here on the right-hand side, and the least selective universities here on the left-hand side. So there are non-selective universities in the United States, and these are sort of less selective universities, and on the far right are the most selective universities in the United States. And you can see this on the horizontal axis is a measure of the selectivity of the university. I've given you the formal definition for it above, but just believe me, these are non-selective and these are the most selective universities in the United States. And these are where high-income students apply to college and university in the United States. What you'll see is that high-income students apply to a combination of universities that are safe, or sicurezza, peer institutions, uguale, so that other students would be like them in terms of their cognitive abilities, and strata, or we call them reach institutions, so it's a stretch to get into those institutions, and a high-income student would typically apply to maybe 10 institutions, 10 universities, some sicurezza, some uguale, some strata, okay? And then only a few high-income students would apply to a non-selective university, and usually those are art schools or music schools or something like that. If you look at low-income students in the United States of the same ability, so very high ability students, but they're from low-income families, what you'll see is that they don't apply to very many of these highly selective institutions. Instead, they mainly are applying to institutions that are non-selective in the United States. That's where a lot of the modal application is flowing to one of those non-selective institutions. This means that they're not going to go to selective universities, not because they applied and they didn't get in, but because they did not bother to apply in the first place, right? They took themselves out of the running for getting into a very selective college or university. Now, I've emphasized here that this is students who are of low income, but it's also students who are of medium income, so just in the middle of the income distribution, but who live in a place where there aren't very many university graduates, or they go to a high school where there aren't very many university graduates among the parents or the teachers. Okay, so they're relatively isolated from university graduates. And These students tend just to go to non-selective colleges and universities, and they often start at one-year programs or two-year programs, the programs that in Italy would be considered not real university programs that lead to the laurea, but rather a one-year or two-year credential, something like that. Okay, it's very similar. So what we do in these papers is we look at the explanations, possible explanations for why it is that students take themselves out of the running and become missing talent. We first look, maybe they don't go to these selective universities because it's too prohibitive in cost. That turns out not to be true because, in fact, if you're a high ability student in the United States, it costs you less to go to a very good university than to go to one of the non-selective ones. We look to see whether they wouldn't be admitted to a very selective college or university. That turns out not to be true. We look to see whether the colleges just aren't trying to recruit these students. That turns out not to be true. We look to see whether they are discouraged by people in their high schools from trying to go to those universities. That turns out not to be true either. So we're left with two explanations. The first one might be that for cultural reasons, people from low-income families or people from families or neighborhoods where not very many people are university graduates don't want to go to a selective university. They feel it would be different from their family or their neighborhood or something like that. So that's explanation number 5. And explanation number 6 is that they just lack the information. It's just confusing. They get confused at the end of high school and they can't figure out what they ought to do because the system is so complicated. In order to test that 6th explanation, because that one is testable, we designed an intervention, an experiment with 40,000 students, and we randomly sent the intervention to most of the students, but we had a control group that was about 7,000 students, and we sent different versions of the intervention to test different hypotheses. I won't go into all of that. It was very inexpensive because we were just sending them information, and the students to whom we were sending the information were very able students. They were cognitively able, so they can read the intervention and try to figure out what the information in it is. And in fact, it seems to have worked very well because our information intervention caused them to change their college-going behavior or university-going behavior a lot. So this is the effect of this intervention on where the students decided to apply to college. They had a 48%, these are the differences, different outcomes on the horizontal axis, and on the vertical axis is the change in percentage terms in their behavior relative to the control students. So for instance, there was a 48% increase in the number of applications that they made to universities, a 56% increase in their probability of making an application to a peer university or an università uguale. The number of universities that admitted the student went up by 31%, and their probability of being admitted by a university that was a peer or uguale university went up by 78%, just hugely, because they weren't applying to them before, but they could have gotten in. So they were taking more advantage of their opportunities when given the information. We also saw that students were actually enrolling in different universities. They had a 46% increase in enrolling at a university that was a peer or equal university. They went to universities that gave out more graduate degrees, more baccalaureate degrees, a 15% increase in that. And the spending of the universities went up by 22% on instruction and 26% on all student activities in these universities. Remember, American universities differ enormously in terms of the resources they have per student, with some universities spending 25 to 30 times as much per student as other post-secondary institutions. So it really makes a big difference which one you choose. They don't all spend the same amount. They're not all very similar to one another. And then finally, we have looked at some long-run outcomes now because the students in the intervention or the experiment are getting older. There's been a 50% increase in their probability of obtaining a dottorato or another highly professional degree like the law or medicina. 62% increase in their probability of entering an occupation that's intensive in research and innovation, and a 30% increase in the probability of entering into a public service occupation, often a kind of leadership role in one of those organizations. Okay, so after doing all of this research, we concluded that around 30% of the extremely talented students in the United States, okay, were missing. Thank you very much, Nadia. Okay, and most of them, as I said, came from low-income families, but some came from isolated middle-income families. All right, so we don't have an experiment for Italy. We didn't get to do an experiment for Italy. So how are we going to look at how many students are missing in Italy? Well, we're going to go back to this diagram that I showed you before. And you remember that this is what the diagram should look for if there are no missing students, right? Okay, so that's just a hypothetical diagram. But now we're going to look at the real data. You'll remember that this is one way to look for missing talent. That's missing talent at a lower level. Here's missing talent at a higher level. The students are losing the students in early post-secondary education. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take data from something called the Program for International Assessment for Adult Competencies, or PIAC. And it's an international study that covers hundreds of countries. It's a very interesting study. It's very valuable. And it has a lot of information on cognitive ability for the people who are tested in the PIAC study, also their educational attainment, their family background, the type of secondary instruction they got, which is relevant for Italy, not so much the United States, and their occupations and their earnings when they're adults. So it's a very comprehensive study. Okay, so we're going to take the data from this study and make that chart for Italy. So not a schematic chart now, not an ideal chart, but what actually shows up in the data. So this is what is realistic for Italy. And what you can see right away is that there is an upward trajectory, right? People who have higher cognitive ability do tend to get higher degrees in Italy. But you'll notice that in this area here, it looks as though there are very wide ranges of cognitive ability. And this is where you're most likely to have missing talent in Italy. So these are people who stop at getting corso regionali brevi, diploma canale, istituti professionali, okay? So these are people who presumably don't do all that well on the end of lower secondary exam. And then after that, although they are of high cognitive ability, they never get channeled towards the universities because they probably don't do licei when they're in a secondary school. And you can see that they overlap. They don't overlap totally, but you can see that some of them look like they have the same cognitive ability as people who go on to much higher degrees. We can also do this in terms of occupations. Those were educational degrees. Normally in economics, we translate occupations into occupational skill levels. I'm just giving you some of the examples here, but 10 is the highest occupational skill level and 1 is the lowest. If we make the same graph for Italy in terms of occupational skill levels, you can see that the missing talent looks like it's about here. These are occupational skill levels 4 and 5. And in particular, those tend to be people who work in the service industry or work in something that has to do with marketing or selling things to people, the retail type of business. So services and retail are especially in here. And you can see that this overlaps with the people who are getting the highest degrees. Again, suggesting that there's missing talent. And where is it? It's in these sorts of occupations that we would associate with maybe having gone to an istituto tecnico, an istituto professionale, something like that, and then stopping and not going on to university. So what are the conclusions for Italy based on the PIAC? It suggests that there are people who are missing talent in Italy, that they're missing because they sort of stop in upper secondary and they don't go on to university and take one of those types of degrees. If you look at the same sort of chart for the United States, you'll see that we also have missing students, but they're stopping at a somewhat different stage. In particular, this is where they're stopping, our missing probable talented students are stopping at, for instance, post-secondary without a diploma is the most important place. So this is students who try to enroll in university, they try and they fail and they drop out, and they never actually end up completing a university degree. So these would be our missing students, and that corresponds with some of the things I said earlier. So the conclusions for the United States based on PIAC are that yes, it affirms what I showed you before with the experiment, which is that there's a lot of missing talent in the United States, but the missing talent is more likely to go missing between high school and the first years of university. So I think there is no perfect system. On the one hand, you have the highly decentralized system in the United States, which has some advantages, but as I've told you, many disadvantages as well, and causes missing talent. And the more centralized systems, such as you have in Italy, which causes a different type of missing talent. And there is a trade-off between the two. You can't have them both, but you can still have some of the best of both worlds. And regardless of which system you have, you don't want to have this amount of missing talent because it's extremely costly for an economy and a society to be missing 20, 30% of the people who are the most talented in their country, who could be adding a lot more, contributing a lot more to the economy and to society. I'm just finishing up now. The main implications, I would say, in terms of policy, would be that for a country like Italy, it might be worthwhile offering more opportunities for discretion or for reevaluation at the end of lower secondary school for people who might actually be of great talent but who don't do particularly well in those exams, or they don't do well on the time they take the exam the first time. So that would be a suggestion. And also there might be more opportunities for rehabilitation. Of course, you don't want to offer too many opportunities for rehabilitation, or you could become like the United States, where everyone drops out and goes back and drops out and goes back. So you don't want to do that. But there could be more opportunities, since very few people seem to do that in Italy. And for the United States, the obvious implication is that we just need to make people much better informed so they don't make errors at the end of secondary school, and when they go on to university, make the wrong decisions that end up not working out very well for them. In conclusion, probably in every country there is missing talent. It's very important for an economy and for a society. And to try and find and foster the talented people in your economy is very important. And every country's probably got to go about it in a different way. Thank you very much.
Grazie, Caroline.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Thank you for this very interesting presentation. Now we have a bit less than 15 minutes for questions from the audience. And so without further ado, I would start with the first questions from the audience.
Thank you very much. So when you were presenting the data about Italy in one of the last few graphs, trying to understand what's the story we can get from them, I was thinking, why can't it be a story of low return to education? So unfortunately, Italy is a country well known for having low return to education. So I was wondering whether part of the missing mass or the excess mass that you showed us is due to some other rational choice that takes into account the fact that you don't have so much return to go on in education. So I was wondering, how to factor in this potential alternative story in the graph you showed.
That's a great question. So the way I would think about it is, if you are in the top 10% of cognitive ability, of cognitive talent, probably you're not the sort of person who would have a low return to going to a university. Yes, I think Italy does not have a high return for higher education across the board, but the very top people should still have a high return. And of course, it's worth remembering that those people have opportunities not just for jobs in Italy, but presumably for jobs all over Europe. So not as dependent on the local labor market. Yeah, that's why I think concentrating on the very high achieving, high cognitive ability people, they're kind of special, right? They're sort of special, but they do contribute. There may be a small number of people, a small share of people, but they contribute very disproportionately.
So first of all, thanks a lot for this very interesting presentation. It's super fascinating. So I wanted to ask you something about what happens in Italy. And in particular, I was wondering if this possibility in the US to go back and forth from education also comes from the fact that individuals are able to build some savings. So almost necessarily, when you have to go back to university, you have or to lower the amount of work you provide on the market, or actually drop for the market for maybe 1 year and then go back for. In Italy, this tends to be a lot more difficult, also because we tend to have very low wages, especially for young people. So I was wondering if you believe that this could be like a theory of financial constraints could be part of the story why in Italy we don't see so much this back and forth, because technically this should be possible, so there are no institutional barriers for this to happen. And so I was wondering if this may be part of the story.
It could be. I think what happens in the United States, though, is not that people save up and then they go back to a university that's as good as the university at which they started. A more common pattern is I go to a good university, I drop out, I work for a while. Then I think, I really need a university degree. So I go back to a university, but it's worse than the one at which I started. I don't pay very much. I drop out again, because I'm not very good at doing university. I work for a while. I go back to a third one. It's even worse than the first and the second one. And maybe it's now an online university where I don't even stop working. I just do it at night, or I do it in my spare time. It may not be very expensive. I take out loans to do it. It's probably not a very good education. So the going in and out of universities in America is not, you don't want to think of it as a great thing to have. It's good to have some opportunities for rehabilitation for people who make mistakes, but you don't want to have so many that you're like the United States, where students go to university at 19 and then they're out at 21 and then they come back at 25 and then they're out at 27 and then they come back at 31 or come back at 41 or something like that. Because it's not, they end up often never even achieving a degree at the end of the day.
Yeah, thank you first of all for your speech. I wanted to add to the first question because about return on education and specifically about one specific education, PhD. So you assume that a lot of smartest people go to do PhDs, but as we may know, that PhDs don't really offer the most lucrative jobs and don't offer like the most well-paying careers, and probably job security is not even that good. So can it be a problem for your assumptions and for your results, like for the interpretation?
Right. So I think it's always difficult to take degrees from different countries and compare the names of them because they're different. So the most high-paying degrees in Italy are actually not the doctorate, not the doctorate degree, but the one just below it, which is the laureate with some extra years added on for something additional, professional. Like I think they're called the long laureates, right? So you would do them if you did medicine or some other things like that. Okay. So those are the ones that are the most remunerative and might have the most stable careers, or often associated with becoming getting a very good government job, for instance. So there's no direct comparison exactly to the United States, but those are also the most remunerative careers in the United States, are medicine, the law, which is a graduate degree for us, not an undergraduate degree for us. And so, but they're similar, and getting the doctorate is not very remunerative, says a professor. Okay, so although we do have a lot of people who get these highest degrees who then go into working in technology, so they do end up making a lot of money. But I think the returns to education are still going up in Italy as you go up to higher and higher degrees until you get to that final one, the doctorate, where it tends to turn down a little bit. Yeah. But also it's worth remembering that Italy, just like the United States, and Europe, just like the United States, the highest growth industries do tend to be in things that are related to high skills. So it's technology, software, medicine, pharmaceuticals, things like this. They still are the highest growth occupations. Earnings growth occupations, I should say.
So thank you for your speech. In a previous conference, we were saying with Professor Garicano that one problem for economic growth in Europe is that with this centralization of universities, that more or less they all have the same budget, etc., it is hard to form clusters of ideas and stuff that it's common in American universities. So my question is, if we centralize more universities, decentralize, sorry, so create those clusters, do you think there would be a backlash for talents because we lose even more talents, for example, in Italy? Or do you think that our system would still be enough centralized so that there are no backlash? Thank you.
So that's a really interesting question. You know, we can think of the two ends of the spectrum having different solutions to this problem. In the United States, no one tells universities to specialize in something. No one tells Stanford to be very good at Silicon Valley technology, things like that. It just does it, okay? And the fact that it does it more than, say, Yale University is not, no one made that choice. They just decided to do it in competition with one another. So that's one way of getting centers of excellence. If you look at the other hyper-centralized system like France, you'll see that les grandes écoles, they're very specialized, right? So Sciences Po is specialized in sciences and so forth and so on. They have engineering schools that are specialized in that. So they've decided to not have equality among their universities, but to instead centralize their specialized highest universities, mostly in Paris, although not exclusively in Paris. So that's a separate solution. Personally, I kind of like the decentralized solution if you're going to have universities trying to figure out what to specialize in, because it allows them to make decisions for themselves based on intellectual grounds. But it's very difficult for a centralized system to do that because it doesn't seem fair, right? So part of the reason why centralized systems tend to produce more equal universities is a fairness, because politicians say it's not fair that my region should not get a special university and this other region should get one. Whereas there's not a lot of fairness in the American system. It's not a specialty of the US system.
I go back to, I'm referring to the Italian situation. I know many young women and young men who are very, very good. Maybe better than the ones from my generation. Young people of today are better than my generation, but unfortunately, they are the victim of a commonplace, of a common belief whereby they don't want to go to work, they're lazy, which is not true, but still, it is true that today it's not worth it to get a degree in Italy. It's not worth it to study and go to university, because a graduate, if things go well, after working really, really hard, after studying, going to internships and being exploited in many ways, well, if things go well, they'll earn €2,000 a month, which is the average wage of a bricklayer. So what's the point of getting a degree? I see a sort of split difference between my generation when, you know, studying was a way to grow and do better in life. It was an opportunity to access to better paid professions and better wages. And now this doesn't happen. So this is something that I feel I need to say. I found no answers. I don't understand whether it's the economic system that's poorer and so it no longer produces profitable jobs. I don't know whether it's a problem of businesses, maybe we're lacking innovation. I can't put my finger on the culprit, on the reason, but the thing is that in Italy today it's not worth it to get a degree. We just have a few minutes, so maybe you can give an answer to this, so you can react in a minute.
Right. Well, I definitely think that there are many countries where going to university does not earn the rewards that it should earn given the skills that someone has acquired. And Italy is not unique in having this problem. There are many other countries where also the returns to getting a higher education are not as great as they should be to reward people for all of the effort that they make and all of the sacrifices that they make, the opportunities that they give up for working during the time that they're at university. That being said, that's not a problem that the educational system can generally solve. That is a problem for the whole economy and the whole society and the way people are rewarded in the economy and society. However, I would say that it's not a good idea ever to miss out on your most talented people because they produce the innovation that produces some of the top paying jobs for very skilled people. And I will just say, I'm an economist. My students, if they get PhDs, they get doctorate degrees. If they do not do well in the academic market, where do they go? They go and work for one of the big Silicon Valley firms doing data work and econometrics and statistics for them. And they get paid a lot, okay? So those innovations, those innovation-based jobs are important even for people like us who are economists.
Grazie mille, Caroline.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. We would have thousands of questions to ask you, but unfortunately, we can't now. Thank you once again for spending your time with us. It's been very interesting. Thank you.
Grazie tante.